The massive arena on Station X-17 glowed with an eerie blue light as thousands of alien species filled its seats. Their chattering and clicking echoed through the ancient structure, built millennia ago by a long-forgotten race. Today marked the opening of the Galactic Federation's Millennial Championship, an event that would decide the fate of countless worlds. In the preparation chamber deep below the arena floor, James Stone stood alone. His simple black combat suit looked out of place among the shimmering, bio-enhanced armor worn by other competitors. The room's metal walls reflected his steady gaze as he checked his equipment one final time. Combat boots, reinforced gloves, and the plain steel knife that had caused so much controversy among Federation officials. A tall, blue-skinned official entered the room, his facial tentacles twitching with what seemed like amusement. "Last chance to withdraw, human. No one would blame your species for accepting its proper place in the galaxy." He paused, examining a holographic display. After all, no primitive species has ever survived past the first round. James continued his equipment check without looking up. "Earth has faced worse odds before," he said quietly, tightening a bootstrap. The official's tentacles twisted in frustration at the lack of fear in the human's voice. 6 months ago, the Federation had arrived at Earth with an ultimatum disguised as an opportunity. Compete in the Millennial Championship or accept protected status, a polite term for colonization. Earth's governments had argued, threatened, and finally realized they had no choice. Humanity needed a champion, and James had stepped forward. The arena's announcement system crackled to life, translating into thousands of languages simultaneously. Beginning first-round matchups, all competitors report to their designated waiting areas. James walked through winding corridors lined with beings from across the galaxy. Some floated in anti-gravity fields, others crawled on multiple legs, and a few existed as pure energy contained in special suits. They all moved aside as he passed, some making gestures that his translation implant identified as signs to ward off bad luck. The viewing chamber offered his first real look at the arena. The circular space could have held 10 football fields, its walls reaching up hundreds of meters to a force field ceiling that simulated an alien sky. The crowd numbered in the hundreds of thousands, with millions more watching through neural links across the galaxy. A small green alien with compound eyes approached James, holding a scanner. "Your weapons, please, for final inspection." The alien's professional tone couldn't quite hide its disdain. "Though I don't see why we bother checking such basic tools." James handed over his knife. The scanner hummed, confirming it contained no hidden technology, just steel, leather, and human craftsmanship. The alien seemed disappointed at finding nothing to disqualify. The first matches began. James watched carefully as beings of incredible power tore into each other. Energy beams crossed the arena. Psychic attacks made competitors collapse screaming, and biological weapons turned sections of the floor to ash. The crowd roared with each display of advanced capability. Then came the announcement he'd been waiting for. Match 7. James Stone of Earth versus Crystalline Warrior of Rigel. The preparation chamber's door opened to the arena floor. James walked out into artificial sunlight as the crowd fell silent. Many had never seen a human before. He looked small, fragile, and hopelessly primitive compared to his opponent materializing on the other side. The Rigel warrior stood 3 meters tall, its crystalline body refracting light into deadly-looking edges. According to the briefing files, it could reshape its form at will and had won dozens of matches through brutal efficiency. James took his stance, knife held low in a grip taught by generations of human warriors. He felt the weight of Earth's future on his shoulders, but kept his breathing steady. The crowd's silence turned to murmurs of confusion. They had expected fear, or at least awe, from the primitive human. Instead, James allowed himself a small smile. They would learn soon enough why humans had survived everything their own world had thrown at them. The galaxy was about to receive an education in why you should never underestimate a species that had clawed its way up from caves to the stars through sheer determination. The starting tone sounded, and James Stone prepared to show the galaxy what humanity could do. The crystal warrior shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. The arena fell silent as the fragments rained down, then reformed into their original shape. James rolled left, his boots finding grip on the scared arena floor. His opponent hadn't expected such quick movement from a primitive human. In the 3 days since his arrival, James had spent every free moment studying recordings of previous matches. The viewing room had become his second home, its holographic displays showing fight after fight. He watched each alien's movement, noted their weaknesses, and planned. Now, that planning was keeping him alive. The crystal being launched razor-sharp shards in all directions. James ducked behind a terrain feature, mind racing. The recordings had shown this attack. Impressive, but it left the warrior vulnerable for exactly 2 seconds while reforming. Stand and face your death with dignity, human. The crystal warrior's voice boomed across the arena. Your species' time in the galaxy is over. James didn't waste breath responding. Instead, he counted the seconds as shards exploded around him. 1, 2. He burst from cover, closing the distance before his opponent could fully reform. The knife in his hand struck at precisely the right angle, sending vibrations through the crystalline structure. In the stands, Federation officials leaned forward in surprise. The human was using the warrior's own resonant frequency against it. Impossible for a primitive species to calculate such things, they thought. But James hadn't calculated anything. He had simply noticed how the crystal being shuddered at certain impacts in previous matches. The warrior screamed in a frequency that cracked nearby viewing screens. It tried to reshape itself, but James kept striking, each blow precisely placed. Cracks appeared in the crystalline surface. High above the arena floor, betting systems crashed as impossibility became reality. A human, armed with nothing but a simple knife and determination, was winning. The recordings show your weakness, James said quietly, though his words carried through the arena's acoustic enhancement system. You rely too much on being unbeatable. You never learn to adapt. The crystal warrior's next attack was desperate, sacrificing defense for all-out assault. James had seen this too, the moment when supposedly superior beings realized they might lose. Their attacks became predictable, driven by fear and anger. He moved like water through the barrage, each step placed with purpose. The knife struck again and again, each hit amplifying the damage of the last. The warrior's crystalline form began to lose cohesion, its attempts to reform becoming sluggish. In the preparation chambers below, other competitors watched in stunned silence. They saw something that terrified them: methodology. The human wasn't winning through superior strength or advanced technology. He was winning through observation, adaptation, and the ruthless application of learned knowledge. One final strike, and the crystal warrior collapsed. Its fragments lay scattered across the arena floor, no longer able to reform. The silence that followed was absolute. James stood in the center of the arena, breathing steadily. His simple black combat suit was dusted with crystal shards, but he was otherwise untouched. He cleaned his knife with practiced movements, the routine helping his heart rate return to normal. The medical teams that rushed out found no one to treat. The security forces that followed them kept their distance, suddenly unsure about approaching this representative of a primitive species. In his private chamber that evening, James reviewed recordings of his own match. He noted his mistakes, mapped out improvements, and began planning for his next opponent. The knife lay on a cleaning cloth beside him, its simple steel blade catching the light. A message flashed on his room's communication panel. The betting odds for his next match had shifted dramatically. The galaxy was learning, but they still didn't fully understand. They thought they had seen humanity's best tricks. James allowed himself a small smile as he continued his study. They hadn't seen anything yet. Tomorrow's opponent was a being of pure energy, and he had already spotted 3 weaknesses in its fighting style. The galaxy was about to learn another lesson about underestimating humans. The energy being exploded against the arena's force field, its light dimming as James stepped away from where it had tried to trap him. 3 matches, 3 victories. The crowd no longer laughed at the human warrior. Match concluded. The arena's AI announced. Winner, James Stone of Earth. James walked from the arena floor as maintenance crews rushed to repair the damage. His boots left footprints in the ash-covered ground, marking his path through what had been an intense battle. The energy being had been fast, but predictable. Like the others, it had never learned to fight someone who could think around its advantages. In the competitor's viewing area, an alien warrior watched James pass. Unlike the others, this one showed no fear or contempt. Its battle-scarred armor and missing eye ridge spoke of long experience. It stepped into James's path. "You fight with honor, human," the warrior said, its translator making the words sound rough. "The others do not understand yet, but I see what you do. You turn their strength into weakness." James stopped, studying the alien. Its remaining eye held wisdom earned through combat. "Most beings here have never lost," James replied. "They don't know how to handle it when someone doesn't follow their rules." The alien warrior made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I am Gray. I lost my title in the last championship because I dared to suggest that pure power is not everything." It gestured to the arena screens showing replays of James's latest victory. "You prove my point with every match." Federation officials hurried past, their data tablets displaying new betting odds and analysis reports. James caught fragments of their worried conversations. Words like impossible and restructure the rankings echoed in various alien languages. "Your next opponent will be different," Gray warned. "The Fire Lord of the Third Spiral. He has noticed your pattern of turning weakness into strength. He will try to leave you no openings." James nodded, already thinking through strategies. Every fighter has a pattern. Even one that tries not to have a pattern creates one by trying to avoid it. Above them, the arena screens showed highlights from James's 3 victories. The crystal warrior shattering, the energy being failing to trap its primitive opponent, and between those, the gravity manipulator who had learned too late that humans could fight effectively even in triple Earth gravity. "They call you primitive," Gray said, watching the replays. "They do not understand that surviving on a primitive world breeds the strongest warriors. When every day is a fight to survive, you learn things that no advanced being can teach." James checked his knife's edge out of habit, the familiar motion calming his mind as he prepared for his next match. "On Earth, we have a saying. Necessity is the mother of invention. When you can't overpower something, you learn to outthink it." The arena thundered with the sound of the next match beginning. A fighter from the gas giants of Epsilon 9 was facing off against a hive mind collective. Both had watched James's matches carefully, and both were fighting differently now, more cautiously. "You have changed things already," Gray observed. "Look how they fight with more thought, less reliance on their natural abilities. They begin to understand, even if they don't realize it yet." James stored his knife in its sheath, his movements precise and economical. "They're learning, but not fast enough." He turned to the old warrior. "The Fire Lord. Tell me about his fights, not his victories. Tell me about the times he almost lost." Gray's remaining eye gleamed with approval. As he began to speak, more competitors gathered to listen. They tried to be subtle about it, but their attention was obvious. The human who had survived 3 impossible matches was planning his next victory, and nobody wanted to miss how he thought. In the arena above, the match continued, but the real action was in the quiet conversation happening below, where a primitive human was teaching the galaxy's greatest warriors how to think differently about combat. The air in James's quarters shifted slightly, just enough to make the hair on his neck rise. He rolled from his sleeping pad as a poisoned dart whispered through the space where his head had been. The assassin, cloaked in light-bending technology, hadn't expected such quick reactions from a sleeping human. James moved purely on instinct, developed through years of combat training. His knife was in his hand before he hit the floor. The assassin's cloak flickered as it moved, a tiny distortion in the air, the only sign of its presence. "The Fire Lord sends his regards," a voice hissed from nowhere. But James was already moving, not toward the voice, but toward the room's environmental control panel. One quick strike disabled the gravity regulators. The assassin, used to the station's artificial gravity, stumbled in the sudden weightlessness. Its cloak malfunctioned, revealing the serpentine form. "Primitive humans," the assassin spat, trying to reorient itself. "You should have died in the first round." James pushed off the wall, using zero-gravity combat techniques practiced in Earth's space programs. "You relied too much on technology," he said calmly, closing the distance, "just like everyone else." The fight was over in seconds. Station security found the assassin bound with torn bedsheets, its advanced weapons and cloaking device disabled by simple physical damage. Gray arrived as security led the assassin away. "The Fire Lord grows desperate," the old warrior said, his single eye taking in the scene. "You have changed too many minds. Some beings fear change more than defeat." James nodded, already checking his equipment for the next day's match. The assassination attempt hadn't surprised him. He'd seen the fear growing in certain competitors' eyes as betting odds shifted and alliances changed. In the arena's public areas, screens showed highlights from his victory over the Fire Lord the day before. It had been his most challenging fight yet. The Fire Lord had studied his previous matches, tried to avoid patterns, but had fallen into new ones instead. James had turned the being's own plasma attacks into a weapon against it, using the arena's environment in ways no one had considered. "The Federation Council is in an uproar," Gray reported, watching James check his nice edge. "Some demand you be disqualified for unsportsmanlike combat. Others argue that your victories prove their ranking system is flawed." James tested his boot's traction, remembering Earth's gravity. They're learning what humans have always known. Real fights aren't about being fair. They're about surviving and protecting what matters. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. The arena's betting systems had crashed again as news of the assassination attempt spread. Species across the galaxy were placing unprecedented wagers on the primitive human who had survived yet another impossible situation. "Your next opponent watches your matches obsessively," Gray warned. "The Mind Weaver from the Pleiades cluster. It believes it has found your weakness." James allowed himself a small smile. "Let me guess. It thinks that because humans don't have natural psychic defenses, we're vulnerable to mental attacks." Gray's eye ridge lifted in surprise. "You knew?" "Every species has tried to use their natural advantages," James explained, storing his knife. "The crystal being thought physical weapons couldn't hurt it. The energy being thought it was untouchable. The Fire Lord thought it was unstoppable. They all forgot one thing." "What's that?" "Humans have spent their entire history being weaker, slower, and less naturally gifted than their predators. We survived by turning disadvantages into advantages. The Mind Weaver will learn what the others learned. Against humans, overconfidence is fatal." As they spoke, the station's screen showed new odds for tomorrow's match. The Mind Weaver was still favored to win, but the margin was smaller than ever. The galaxy was starting to understand that betting against humanity was a dangerous gamble. In his quarters, James began his pre-fight routine, mind already working through strategies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but that was nothing new for a species that had evolved on one of the galaxy's most dangerous worlds. The Mind Weaver floated in the arena's center, its translucent body pulsing with psychic energy. Most beings would have already fallen to their knees, overwhelmed by its mental assault. Instead, James walked forward steadily, his mind focused on a single memory, the taste of his mother's apple pie. "Impossible," the Mind Weaver's thoughts boomed through the arena. "No primitive mind can resist my power." But James had trained for this. Back on Earth, he had spent months working with meditation masters, learning to fill his mind with simple, powerful memories. The Mind Weaver's attacks slid off these thoughts like water off stone. In the stands, telepathic species watched in shock. They could sense the Mind Weaver's growing frustration as it tried to break through James's mental defenses. The human's mind should have been easy to overwhelm. Instead, it was like trying to move a mountain with a breeze. Your species has no psychic abilities, the Mind Weaver projected, its body glowing brighter with effort. You cannot hope to match my power. James took another step forward. In his mind, he could smell the pie cooling on the windowsill, hear his mother's laugh, feel the warm summer breeze. The memory was a fortress no external force could breach. We don't need psychic powers, James said calmly. Humans learned long ago that the strongest walls aren't built of force, but of something much more basic. The Mind Weaver launched its strongest attack yet. Images of terror and pain crashed against James's consciousness, but they found no purchase in a mind filled with love and home, and the simple pleasure of a perfect apple pie. Gray, watching from the competitor's area, began to understand. By the stars, he whispered, the human isn't fighting the psychic attack at all. He's simply not there to be attacked. The Mind Weaver's frustration grew. It had never encountered a mind it couldn't dominate through either pain or fear. But this human's consciousness was like a smooth sphere. There was nothing to grab, no weakness to exploit. James continued his steady advance. Each step was measured, deliberate. In his mind, the memory played on, the crunch of the crust, the sweetness of the apples, his mother's proud smile. Simple things, human things. What are you? The Mind Weaver demanded, its mental voice showing fear for the first time. Just a human, James replied. But you made the same mistake all the others made. You thought because we lack your advantages, we must be weak. You never considered that lacking those advantages made us strong in different ways. He was close now, almost within arm's reach. The Mind Weaver tried to retreat, but its concentration was broken. Without its psychic dominance, it had no combat experience to fall back on. Humans don't have natural armor, James continued, his voice carrying through the silent arena. So we learned to dodge. We don't have claws, so we made tools. We don't have psychic powers. His hand shot out, grabbing the Mind Weaver's physical form. The being's body was delicate, evolved for mental combat rather than physical confrontation. So we learned to strengthen our minds in other ways. The fight ended not with a mental blast, but with a simple hole that any human child could learn. The Mind Weaver, for all its psychic power, had no defense against basic physical combat. As the arena's AI announced his victory, James released his opponent gently. The memory of apple pie faded from his mind, leaving behind the satisfied feeling of a strategy well executed. In the stands, telepathic species sat in stunned silence. They had just witnessed something they thought impossible. A mind without psychic abilities defeating one of the galaxy's strongest mental warriors. Gray met him at the arena's exit. You didn't just win, the old warrior said with respect. You showed them all a new way to think about strength. James nodded, already focusing on his next match. The semifinals would bring even greater challenges, but that was fine. After all, facing impossible challenges was humanity's specialty. Blood dripped from James's left arm as he faced his opponent in the semifinals. The defending champion, a bioengineered warrior named Ultimate, stood 3 meters away, its perfect form showing no signs of fatigue. The fight had already lasted longer than any other match in arena history. You surprise me, human, Ultimate said, its engineered voice perfectly controlled. No one has ever lasted this long against me. But you must see that victory is impossible. I was created to be perfect. James wiped blood from a cut above his eye. His ribs ached from a blow that would have killed most beings. But he remained standing, his grip on the knife still steady. Perfect is predictable, he replied, breathing carefully around his injured ribs. And predictable can be beaten. The arena floor around them was scared from their battle. Ultimate had demonstrated why it was champion: incredible speed, strength, and fighting ability, all wrapped in an engineered body that could heal almost instantly. It had been created in a laboratory to be the galaxy's greatest warrior, but it had never faced a human before. In the stands, the crowd watched in stunned silence. Many had bet their fortunes on Ultimate winning quickly. Now, 6 hours into the fight, the betting systems were completely overwhelmed as species across the galaxy watched a primitive human match the supposedly perfect warrior blow for blow. "You cannot win," Ultimate stated, launching another attack. Its movements were flawless, each strike aimed at vital points with mechanical precision. "I am superior in every way." James moved like water, not trying to match Ultimate's strength, but using its own power against it. Where Ultimate was perfect, James was unpredictable. Where it was flawless, he was creative. His knife found gaps in its defenses that shouldn't have existed. "Superior?" James asked, ducking under a strike that would have taken his head off. "Maybe. Stronger? Definitely." He landed a counter that drew silver blood from Ultimate's engineered form. "But you were created to be perfect. I was born to adapt." Ultimate's attacks became faster, its engineered muscles pushing beyond normal limits. But with each exchange, James learned, adapted, evolved his strategy. The knife in his hand became an extension of his will, finding weaknesses that Ultimate's creators had never considered. "This is impossible," Ultimate said, true emotion creeping into its engineered voice for the first time. "You are only human." "Only human." James laughed, though it hurt his ribs. "That's like saying the sun is only fire." Being human means never accepting limits. It means looking at the impossible and finding a way. He thought of Earth's history, of people facing overwhelming odds and refusing to submit, of soldiers on beaches facing unstoppable enemies, of pioneers crossing oceans in wooden ships, of astronauts sitting on controlled explosions to reach the stars. Ultimate's next attack was a combination of moves that had won it 100 victories. Perfect, practiced, unstoppable. But James had seen it coming. In Ultimate's perfection, he had found its pattern. The knife moved almost too fast to see. Ultimate's silver blood splashed across the arena floor as James's blade found the one weakness in its engineered form, the place where perfect predictability met human creativity. Ultimate fell to one knee, its silver blood pooling beneath it. "How?" it asked, genuine confusion in its voice. "I was perfect." James stood over his fallen opponent, his own injuries forgotten in the moment of victory. "Perfect isn't enough," he said quietly. "Not against a species that evolved on a death world, that faced extinction a dozen times and survived. Perfect can't beat impossible. And humans, we eat impossible for breakfast." The arena's AI announced his victory as medical teams rushed in. The crowd's silence erupted into chaos as betting systems crashed across the galaxy. The impossible had happened. A human was going to the finals. Gray met him at the medical station as doctors treated his injuries. "You've done more than win," the old warrior said. "You've shown them all what humanity truly is." James nodded, already thinking about the final match tomorrow. "They thought they knew what perfect meant," he said. "Time to show them what impossible looks like." The Federation Council chamber erupted in chaos as James stood calmly before them. His victory in the finals had been decisive, but it was what he did afterward that had thrown the galaxy into turmoil. He had refused the champion's crown. "This tournament," James said, his voice carrying through the massive chamber, "was meant to prove humanity's worth, to show we deserve to be free." He looked at each council member in turn. "I think we've done more than that. We've proven that your entire system of ranking species needs to change." The head counselor, a being of pure light, pulsed with agitation. "You cannot simply demand we change traditions that have existed for millennia." "Actually," James replied, "I can. Because this tournament has shown everyone that your traditions are based on false assumptions." The crowds watching through holographic displays across thousands of worlds hung on every word. James's victories had already sparked rebellions on dozens of primitive worlds. Species that had accepted their place at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy were beginning to question everything. Gray stood at James's side, his old warrior's armor gleaming under the chamber's lights. "The human speaks truth," he announced. "I have witnessed every championship for 3 centuries. None have shown such courage, such innovation, such—" He paused, looking at James with his one good eye: humanity. The final match had lasted barely 5 minutes. James had taken everything he'd learned from every previous fight and combined it into a strategy that left the galaxy speechless. His opponent, a legendary warrior from the galactic core, had never even landed a blow. "Your rankings are based on natural advantages," James continued. "Strength, speed, psychic power, technological advancement. But this tournament has proven that true power comes from something else: the ability to adapt, to think differently, to face impossible odds and find a way to win." The council chamber's screen showed highlights from his matches: the Crystal Warrior shattering, the Mind Weaver defeated by a memory of apple pie, Ultimate brought down by its own perfection. Each victory had seemed impossible until a human showed the galaxy what impossible really meant. "We're not asking for special treatment," James said, his voice firm. "We're demanding equal treatment for Earth and for every other species you've labeled primitive, because we've proven that your labels mean nothing." A younger council member floated forward. "And if we refuse?" James smiled, the same calm smile that had unnerved so many opponents. "The betting systems weren't the only things that crashed during my matches. Your information networks are overwhelmed with species demanding change. They've seen what one human could do. How long before they realize what they could do?" The council chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. James had done more than win fights. He had sparked a revolution in how species view themselves and each other. "The galaxy is changing," Gray announced to the council. "You can lead that change or be swept aside by it." The head counselor's light dimmed slightly in what might have been resignation. "What are your terms?" "Simple," James replied. "No more protected status. No more species rankings. Every world gets to choose its own path. And Earth gets a seat on this council, not because we're stronger or more advanced, but because we've shown that different perspectives make everyone stronger." As the council debated, James thought about home, about apple pies cooling on windowsills, about humanity's long history of facing impossible odds, about the simple determination that had taken his species from caves to the stars. The council's decision was unanimous. They had seen the future in James's victories, a galaxy where strength came in many forms, where being different didn't mean being inferior, where humanity's greatest gift to the stars was showing that impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet. As James prepared to return to Earth, Gray approached him one final time. "You've changed everything," the old warrior said. James shook his head. "No, we've just reminded the galaxy of something it forgot. The most dangerous thing in the universe isn't strength, or speed, or even perfect engineering. It's the will to never give up, no matter the odds." The galaxy would never be the same. And that was exactly what humanity did best: changing the impossible into the inevitable, one small step at a time.